Do you ever wonder why even the most articulate and knowledgeable people struggle to explain what Bitcoin is? Or why it takes time to understand Bitcoin? It's because Bitcoin is synergetic. Well, what does that mean? An important part of Bucky's work culminated in a 1,300-page body of work that he called Synergetics. He defined synergetics as behavior of whole systems that are unpredicted by the behavior of any component in isolation. He observed life and the universe was synergetic. He liked to say there is nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it will turn into a butterfly. A sailboat which sails into the wind is an example of synergetic behavior. If you told me that a sailboat can sail into the wind, I would be quick to say that's impossible. But we all know that sailboats do behave like this. At first glance, it is entirely counterintuitive. To understand why sailboats can sail into the wind requires looking at the whole system: the boat, sail, ocean, wind, and keel together, not just the individual parts. Bitcoin is similarly synergetic. This is why there is no linear step-by-step way to explain Bitcoin. You need an understanding of several different domains before arriving at understanding. This is one reason why many initially conclude that Bitcoin is useless. Studying one aspect of Bitcoin is akin to concluding that it is impossible for a sailboat to sail into the wind. This is why so-called specialists might struggle to understand Bitcoin. Their perspective is myopic. This is also why there are occasionally discoveries that don't work in theory but do in practice. For example, many experts were adamant that heavier-than-air flight machines were physically impossible. Bucky would say, synergetic behavior is always, by definition, a surprise. It is utterly unpredictable from studying parts of a larger system in isolation. He would use the example of how the poison sodium and the poison chlorine create sodium chloride, or salt, an important part of our diet. To quote Bucky, bias precludes synergetic advantage. Interestingly, he knew economists would not see Bitcoin coming because it did not fit in their framework. To quote, economists traditionally try to maximize what you have, but the idea that you could go from wire to wireless, or from visible structuring to invisible alloy structuring did not occur to them at all. It was outside their point of view, beyond their range of vision. No economic accounting books list metaphysical assets, he would say. Because their model of the world did not contain metaphysical assets, they were unable to predict the system behavior that would result from an asset like Bitcoin. Interestingly, Bucky's work is similarly synergetic. It requires the patience to complete his body of work before things start to click and make sense. If you don't understand a word, sentence, chapter, or even an entire book, keep going. Without the patience to sit with his words, his work can understandably come across as irrelevant and incoherent. But I assure you there is meaning and method to his madness. Bucky's grandson had excellent advice for studying Bucky's work. He advises to treat the process similar to learning a new language. You may read many things that won't make sense, but you need to continue without getting hung up on the terminology or run-on sentences. With time, things will start to click, much like when learning a new language. If you get caught up trying to make sense of everything from the beginning, you won't get very far. Bucky was unabashedly redundant, knowing that many concepts would take multiple encounters before they started to make sense. To quote, it literally takes 4 experiences for the mind to discover that there is an interrelationship significance going on here that was not to be evidenced in the one experience by itself. If you have studied Bitcoin, this will sound familiar. No one gets it the first time around. There is evidence that this style of communication was intentional on his part. This is how he time-locked Bitcoin the idea into the future. He understood there would be a level of cognitive energy required to piece his work back together, and that this process would inherently take time. he sufficiently broke up his work to stay dormant for approximately 50 years. It is a rudimentary form of the difficulty adjustment. No matter how much hash rate you throw at it, the average block time is roughly 10 minutes. This is how Satoshi time-locked Bitcoin, the units, into the future. Similarly, Bucky intentionally broke up his work to time-lock Bitcoin, the idea, into the future. He understood the world would eventually need it, and someone would be able to piece it back together once computers were readily available. Emergence by emergency, he would say. Bucky was adamant about experimenting. Through experiments, he could discover system behavior that was impossible in theory. In theory, the Byzantine general's problem was impossible to solve. In practice, it is. For this reason, I have begun with a holistic view of Bucky's work and will work back into the specifics. It is the only way to understand synergetic systems like Bucky and Bitcoin. To quote Bucky, there is nothing about a proton that predicts a neutron. You must begin with the whole system and work your way backwards. Synergetic behavior is, by definition, always a surprise.